Tonight we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
For the first time on television, an exclusive interview with the lead detective who just quit the case.
Do the police know who killed JonBenet Ramsey?
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 43 in the ongoing series dealing with Detective Steve Thomas's resignation letter. It's a scathing letter. It gained nationwide attention. It even appeared in the New York Times, and the first paragraph in that article from August 8th, 1998 reads, quote, Boulder's mayor today demanded an investigation into complaints by a city police detective that the district attorney's office had effectively crippled the 20-month investigation into the killing of JonBenet Ramsey. These charges should not be left unchallenged, Mayor Bob Greenlee said of an 8-page letter of resignation that Steve Thomas, the police detective, tendered here on Thursday. It is confusing and unacceptable to me that people are unaccountable or not responding. Today, which would have been JonBenet's 8th birthday, found official Colorado in turmoil over the detective's farewell blast. Calling for the nomination of a special prosecutor in the case, Mr. Thomas wrote, I believe the district attorney's office is thoroughly compromised. And that's a quote from this article in the New York Times. The article is titled, Call for Inquiry After Detective Says District Attorney Botched the JonBenet Ramsey Investigation. Now, isn't that a turn for the books? You've got, in the current narrative, all the talk is about the Boulder police botched the investigation. And I can tell you, in a lot of the comments and a lot of the videos, people have taken this to be true. And it certainly is true that there are instances of the police botching the investigation. But I hope that when I read this letter to you from Steve Thomas, it's going to change your understanding of the Boulder police. As you know, I've heard all sorts of nasty references to them as, you know, bumbling and Keystone cops. And that criticism, shouldn't it be directed to the district attorney's office? And except it's not bumbling there, it's purposeful obstruction of justice. Now, interestingly, the response in this same New York Times article by James Brooke refers to a spokeswoman for Alex Hunter, Suzanne Lorien. She was the spokeswoman for the then district attorney, and she called Steve Thomas's letter, quote, substantially false and misleading. And then there was a joint statement from Boulder police and the prosecutors saying, you know, something about our primary responsibility is to gather sufficient evidence to prosecute the JonBenet Ramsey homicide. And what's really interesting in that little snippet there is they're talking about sufficient evidence. Do we have enough evidence to take this case to trial? And that's also been a very misleading aspect, is that, oh, maybe there wasn't enough evidence to take this case to trial. Well, you know, just JonBenet's body in the Ramsey home is a heck of a lot of evidence. If we go a little bit further through this article in the New York Times, it refers to ABC News on Thursday night first obtaining this letter from, I guess, Steve Thomas, and then it refers to the letter of resignation from Steve Thomas, quote, cutting through some of the fog that has surrounded the investigation, end quote. I think that is so well put, that the JonBenet Ramsey investigation is so well known as just being smoke and mirrors, and quite well executed as well, quite clever, quite crafty. And in this episode, we're going to really look, I mean, the best place to do is go to Steve Thomas's own words. You can find his letter online it's published in the Daily Camera. on I think the 6th of August 1998. It's also in Steve Thomas's book, and it's also in Kolar's book on page 469 of Foreign Faction. There are also other letters, like the letter of Lou Smith, and then there's also Fleet White's letter, and hopefully we'll get to those at some point. I'm not sure if we'll get to them in this episode. In this episode, we're going to deal with Steve Thomas's letter. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment. A big thank you to those who have subscribed and joined Patreon. You can join Patreon on patreon.com/TCRS. And let's get started.
We've all seen a lot of stories about the JonBenet Ramsey case, but tonight we have new details, new information.
Isn't it amazing, Diane, that it's been 2 years and we are still fascinated by this case?
And 2 years in which no charges have been brought, no indictment has been brought. And we can't emphasize enough that the Ramseys are presumed innocent under the law, and evidence is still being gathered. But tonight we have provocative new information that sources tell us comes from the police investigation.
Now, that audio clip comes from ABC's 2020 from September 27th, 1998, an episode titled, What Happened to JonBenet Ramsey? If the JonBenet Ramsey case needed a hand grenade thrown into the trenches to get the investigation back on track, then this was it. On August 6, 1998, on what would have been JonBenet's 8th birthday, Detective Steve Thomas resigned, but instead of leaving quietly, Thomas lobbed a grenade in the form of a 3,217-word, 8-page letter. Now, in some sources refer to this as a 6-page letter, whatever, but the point is it was a long letter. In Kolar's book, the letter is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pages in terms of the pagination of Foreign Faction. Now, there was no cloak and dagger about Thomas's letter. He didn't mince words. He placed blame for the stalling of the case and the quagmire of the investigation squarely at the feet of the district attorney. Now, bear in mind, all of this is happening before the grand jury trial even happens, before there's even an announcement that there's going to be a grand jury trial, and of course, before the conclusion of the grand jury trial. We all know how that went, didn't we? Now, I want to be clear that it's not my idea to mention this idea of throwing a hand grenade into the case. That's actually something that came from Elizabeth Vargas in this particular episode. So in other words, at the time, in September 1998, this was the sense from the journalists that there was this fog, this intransigence, this lethargy, this limbo. And thanks to Steve Thomas writing this letter, not just a one-page letter, not a short, simple letter, resignation, he dropped a bomb on the case, and it actually had real and lasting consequences. So we can be grateful for that letter. But the impression from the journalists at the time was that on his way out the door, Detective Steve Thomas threw the equivalent of a grenade, and it basically got the show on the road in a way. The Associated Press on August the 7th, 1998, reported detective in Ramsey case quits, and they said that basically echoed obviously what was in the New York Times, that Steve Thomas was claiming the district attorney's office was thoroughly compromised, not a little bit compromised, thoroughly compromised. And they referred to Thomas as one of the original detectives assigned to investigate the slaying of JonBenet Ramsey. He'd resigned in protest of this continuing travesty. What's the continuing travesty? The compromised aspect, or the way that the district attorney's office seemed to be compromised in terms of what its mandate was, which was to pursue justice in particular cases. And it goes on, this article goes on accusing Alex Hunter's office of quote-unquote sacrificing procedure for politics. The letter is scathing, and if anything, I think those responsible for the investigation or lack of deserved a scathing judgment or a scathing voice and a finger pointing in their direction. And as I say, his letter drew national attention, and it seemed to achieve its goal. If pressure was needed to get the district attorney to call a grand jury, the pressure worked. In the month following Thomas's resignation, District Attorney Alex Hunter finally did what needed to be done. It took him 20 months, almost 2 years, but he did it. And according to ABC, this is something that came up in the show. They said in a voiceover, quote, 1 year, 8 months and 21 days after the murder of John Benet Ramsey, grand jurors assembled here in Boulder to begin reviewing evidence in the case. Sources say much of it implicates her parents. The proceedings here are secret, and unlike witnesses in federal grand juries, witnesses here cannot even reveal they testified, end quote. I do think it's very interesting that Alex Hunter only brought together the grand jury when he really had his arm twisted by the whole of America essentially looking on what was going on in Boulder. You had the mayor weighing in, the governor weighing in, all sorts of people talking about it, and then he caved into the pressure, but then he did what he did ultimately. He sort of did what they wanted, and then what did he do kind of behind the scenes, behind the curtains, behind the fog of secrecy? So about 6 weeks after writing his letter of resignation, on September 27th, ABC swooped in to interview the justifiably disgruntled detective, that's Steve Thomas. And I've actually provided a clip of that interview. It's quite amazing. It's a half-hour special on 2020 that is available to the folks on Patreon. You can watch that episode. And this was Steve Thomas's first on-camera interview ever.
We also have the first interview ever with one of the lead detectives who served on the case from the beginning and who recently resigned in protest, and you'll find out why. A grand jury in Colorado is just beginning to review the murder evidence in secret now.
What was incredible about this episode, especially in light of what we've seen for so long, especially over the past decade or so, including from ABC of late, including in their most recent documentary, The List, is this focus on the intruder theory. And so what is very interesting about this particular episode, 23 years ago, really, 2 years after the events, was that Elizabeth Vargas and her team focused on the Boulder police narrative, which is a narrative that is very glossed over these days. The Boulder cops are the ones who bungled and botched everything, and this whole narrative that comes from Steve Thomas about the district attorney, that's been lost in kind of a fog of post-truth. And in any event, what was really special and really incredible about this particular episode was it dealt with a presentation the Boulder cops did on the 1st and 2nd of June, which is around about 2 months before Steve Thomas resigned. And this is just a quote from Elizabeth Vargas in that documentary. She says, "Our information of what was said in that meeting," that's the meeting from the 1st and 2nd of June, that the Boulder police they presented their case to the district attorney's office, was, and this is a quote from Elizabeth Vargas, was that the meeting, and this is from well-placed sources in various law enforcement agencies, that certain inferences were made about the guilt of the Ramseys, and ABC was careful to say, we want to emphasize that there may be evidence to the contrary that's not available to us. There are different conclusions that could be drawn, and we just want to remind you that in law, all people are considered innocent until proven guilty. And then they laid out their case. regarding the let's call it the inculpatory evidence in terms of the Ramseys. I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail here, but what we will do is go into the letter of Steve Thomas. So obviously I'm quoting from this basically public document. As I said, it appeared in numerous media, in numerous narratives, and it was something that Detective Steve Thomas wanted the public to see. And so he wrote in the second paragraph, he writes, quote, "The primary reason I chose to leave, in other words, resign, is my belief that the District Attorney's Office continues to mishandle the Ramsey case. I had been troubled for many months with many aspects of the investigation. Albeit an uphill battle for a case to begin with, it became a nearly impossible investigation because of political alliances, philosophical differences, and professional egos that blocked progress in more ways and on more occasions than I can detail in this memorandum." So what he's trying to say is, even though he's written a 3,000 word report, and even though it is so many pages long, he's saying there were so many instances of how their efforts were sabotaged, blocked, frustrated, and he wasn't going to go into more detail than he did. He does say that I and others voiced these concerns repeatedly. So it wasn't as though they worked in silence and didn't say what was going on. They repeatedly said this is unacceptable. And what shocked them was that nothing happened, that there was this sort of brazen steamrolling over these people, which has really gone on for 25 years. That same sense of propriety of we're going to just do whatever we want, that same sense of entitlement and privilege, right? And so he goes on to say, in the interest of hoping justice would be served, we tolerated it, except for those closed-door sessions when detectives protested in frustration, where fists hit the table, and where detectives demanded that the right things be done. The wrong things were done and made it a matter of simple principle that I could not continue to participate as it stood with the District Attorney's Office. As an organization, we remained silent when we should have shouted. Now, in this respect, I want to refer to John Andrew Ramsey, who has put up a couple of tweets of late, and I think he also appeared in the 2020 episode recently, the documentary. And he was making the inference that the Boulder police lacked passion, lacked heart, that they were perhaps lazy or perhaps not very passionate about what they were doing. And does this sound like that is the case? Or does it sound like the laziness, the lack of interest, the lack of urgency was actually coming from the District Attorney's Office? And you've also got to ask yourself, did the Ramseys not know that? Did the Ramseys really think that the Boulder police weren't interested in the case, given, and we're going to look at some of the stats here, we're going to look at the enormity of the case file, the number of people that they'd interviewed, the documentation, the detail. We're going to look at all of that. And then you must ask yourself, who here was dragging their feet? Who here was lacking passion? The other thing that I think is quite interesting from John Andrew Ramsey's Twitter is he talks about Stevie Boy, and this is obviously a reference to Steve Thomas, making a profit out of the death of his half sister, right? And, I just think it's very unfair because Lou Smith was also involved in a book on the Ramsey case, and in fact that book was 90% completed when Lou Smith died. And the name of that book is Injustice: Why JonBenet Ramsey Was Murdered by a Sadistic Psychopath, Not Her Parents. So it's just abundantly obvious what is going on here is that the author is trying to say not her parents did it, right? It's very obvious. And the authors for that book are Robert Whitson and then Andrew Lou Smith. And it's easy to imagine that oh, it's not Lou Smith, it's somebody else, it's Andrew Lou Smith. In the description for this particular narrative, it refers to Andrew Lou Smith was stricken with cancer and passed away on August 11th, 2010, after this book was 90% written. In other words, so here is somebody else who was also writing a book on the case. It seems a little bit disingenuous, it seems a little bit hypocritical, doesn't it, to be talking about, writing books about a case when the Ramsey investigator did exactly the same thing, wouldn't you say?
It's a little hypocritical, wouldn't you say?
So Steve Thomas says, as an organization, and there he's referring to the Boulder Police Department, he said, we remained silent when we should have shouted. So you kind of had the District Attorney's Office releasing statements, you had the Ramseys engaging with the media when it suited them, and then you had the Boulder Police, whose job it was to investigate the case, who kind of knew about the case, and they are muzzled. They're not allowed to say anything. And that muzzling has basically continued until the present day. He goes on to write, quote, the Boulder Police Department took a handful of detectives days after the murder and handed us the case. As one of those 5 primary detectives, we tackled it for a year and a half. We conducted an exhaustive investigation. We followed the evidence where it led us, and were faithfully and professionally committed to this case. Although not perfect, cases rarely are. During 18 months on the Ramsey investigation, my colleagues and I worked the case night and day, in spite of tied hands. On June 1 and 2, 1998, we crunched 30,000 pages of investigation to its essence and put our cards on the table, delivering the case in a formal presentation to the District Attorney's Office. We stood confident in our work. Very shortly thereafter, though, the detectives who know the case better than anyone were advised by the District Attorney's Office that we would not be participating as grand jury advisory witnesses, end quote. So we're at around about the 20-minute mark. I'm not going to take it further than this for the folks on YouTube. If you want to follow the rest of this commentary, head on to patreon.com/TCRS. Thank you for listening.
Marks for the detectives who brought him an impressive sampling of Patsy Ramsey's writings, letters, notes, even files police retrieved from the family computer.
My experience with the Boulder detectives was that they were entirely professional in their work, that they were dedicated to the case.